please.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I come with a Brandomian background, so I'm here to learn. Any suggestions, remarks, observations, criticism are very welcome. So the game of giving and asking for labor is supposed to be a catchy title, but what's behind it? Well, as already said, Brandom ushered analytic philosophy from its Kantian to its Hegelian stage, and of course we are all here to usher it into the Marxian stage. My contribution to this endeavor would be to try and suggest some ways to transpose Brandom's reading of Hegel into a reading of Marx, or some of it. So Brandom gave a semantic reading of the Phenomenology of Spirit. Can we give a semantic reading of Marx? That's the challenge. I think that we can. I think that we can find semantic ideas in Marx. I think that we can try and define a notion of material content based on his notion of labor, or his use of the notion of labor. And that would be the main part of my talk. After that, if we still have time, I will try to focus on some problems of this approach. And in particular, I will focus on the problem of the objectivity of contents, which is a traditional problem in normative inferentialism. The problem is this: suppose that we have a notion, we have a materialist approach to semantics, and we have a notion of material content. Is that content independent from the attitudes of the participants to a language game? So that's the problem. And before all that, anyway, I think we have to address another problem. It's the problem of the hermeneutics of Brandom's reading. We must be clear on what to expect and what not to expect from a corresponding reading of Marx, because we may well not like it at all. I will not try to defend Brandom's hermeneutics, but I still think it's something that we have to discuss. So what is his hermeneutics? Yeah. In the Tales of the Mighty Dead, he elaborates on Gadamer. He says, well, the approaches to the interpretation of a text span between two extremes. On the one hand, the idea that a text has a meaning, and the purpose of an interpretation is to find it. On the other side, on the other hand, the other extreme, the idea that a text doesn't have a meaning independently from an interpretation. So the purpose of an interpretation is to make a meaning for the text. According to Brandom, both extremes are wrong. Meanings are neither found nor made, they are made explicit. The correct view is to acknowledge that to give an interpretation is to specify the content of a claim on the background of a set of commitments. What commitments? Well, it depends. One might be interested in the perspective of the author, on what the author takes their claim to mean and to imply. In that case, the relevant set of commitments is the set of commitments endorsed by the author themselves. In this case, we give a dedicto reading of the text. A dedicto reading specifies the content of the text, of the claim, from the perspective of the author. But that is not the only perspective one could be interested in. One could be interested also in what really follows from a claim, what really the claim means, not what the author takes it to mean. Let me give you an example. And this is the second time we quote De Anima of Aristotle in this conference. So Aristotle claims in the book on soul that affections, the pathemata, affections of the soul, are logoi, annuloi, and mattered forms. Now, today, philosophers discuss whether Aristotle said of the mind that it is embodied. Now, of course, Aristotle didn't have the notion of the mind, didn't have the concept of the mind. So we cannot specify the dicto, his claim, as being about the mind. But there is a sense in which it is legitimate to ask whether Aristotle was talking about the mind in this passage. That would be a de re reading of Aristotle. A de re reading specifies a claim from the real perspective, from the correct set of commitments. Tries to specify what a claim really means, what it really implies. But then, of course, what is the real perspective? What is the correct set of commitments? Well, in Brandom, of course, that cannot be an absolute notion. It's a set of commitments endorsed by the interpreter. But then you see we have a risk with the rare readings. And the risk is to transform authors in puppets that do not speak at their own will, but they speak at our command. So the rare reading is a risky business. When all goes well, we have a dialogue with the authors. We ask them questions about things that interest to us. They give us answers. Sometimes these are useful to us, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they approve what we take their claims to mean or to imply. Sometimes they don't. Some of the ideas get enhanced, some go amiss. So we have to be careful with this. I must confess that I'm not completely at ease with this approach. I think I see the value of it, but I hesitate to present to you what I'm going to say about Marx as a reading of Marx. But still, again, I still think that we have to consider this approach if we want to bring Marx and Brandom together. By the way, I have a mental image of Bob with this puppet of Hegel a decade ago, maybe in Berlin, while he was working on a spirit of trust. But maybe it's just my imagination. So, can we ask semantic questions to Marx? And if so, what questions? I think we have to follow Brandom on this point. So what questions did Brandom ask to Hegel? Well, there are many, but there is a major one. And it's a question, again, that has haunted normative inferentialism forever. Where do the norms come from? First of all, how is this a semantic question? Well, the story is well known. It has been repeated already yesterday. Let me rehearse it briefly. The basic semantic idea of normative inferentialism is, actually it's due to Sellars. And it's a functionalist one. It's the idea that to have content is to play a role in the game of giving and asking for reasons. Something has a content because it can be offered as a reason, as a justification, and justifications can be given for it. Relations of justifications are inferential relations, so we can define contents in terms of inferential roles. According to Brandom, inferential relations make explicit normative relations in a practice. And that is basically the bare bones of normative inferentialism. Let me give you a brief example. This is very basic. It's a toy example, but it will be useful later for a comparison. So suppose someone is committed to O is red, where O is an object. So let's say a BlackBerry. The BlackBerry is red. If one is committed to the BlackBerry is red, one is also committed to the BlackBerry is colored. One can use the BlackBerry is red to justify the BlackBerry is colored. The BlackBerry is red implies the BlackBerry is colored. On the other hand, if one is committed to the BlackBerry is red, one is not entitled to the BlackBerry is black. One can use the BlackBerry is black to challenge the commitment to the BlackBerry is red. The BlackBerry is red and the BlackBerry is black are incompatible. Now, once you have relations of implication and incompatibility, you can define inferential rules. You can define what follows from what and what does not follow from what. So this is the basic structure. But then there's a problem, of course, because normative relations are established by, in terms of the rules of the game. But who makes the rules of the game? According to Brandom, rules are determined. The content of the rules is determined by the attitudes of the participants to the game of giving and asking for reasons. The attitudes of discursive scorekeepers. But then, how could contents be objective if they are attitude dependent? This is the point on which most of the criticism of making it explicit have focused. This is an example of the frustration that this point gave to Brandom's critics. The heart-stopping final chapter of Making It Explicit is structured as a mystery thriller. 600 pages into our story, the source of normativity is still a fugitive on the lam. Many, like Rosen, have searched for the origin of normativity in Making It Explicit, and they haven't found it. And that's because that is not a topic in Making It Explicit. It's a topic in A Spirit of Trust, which is Brandom's book on Hegel. So Brandom asks Hegel about the origins of normativity, asks for an account of normativity. And Hegel answers, and his answer is twofold. On the one hand, he says normative statuses are established by the attitudes of reciprocal recognition, the attitudes or reciprocal recognition of the participants to the game of giving and asking for reasons. On the other hand, the content of the normative statuses are determined in a socio-historical process in which the analytic structure of reality is matched by the normative structure of contents. The structure is the same, it comes in two flavors, so to speak. But then you see that if you look at the game of giving and asking for reasons from this point of view, it looks like the manifestation of a universal discursive reason, a discursiveness that understands itself by making explicit the norms of the game and by improving them, changing them in a socio-historical process of experience. And of course, this is a form of objective idealism. And many have found this not completely satisfactory, so to speak. Can we do better by asking Marx about the origin of normativity? Does he have something to say about the origins of the norms and the objectivity of contents? Well, let's see. If we look at the work of Marx from this point of view, I think that it's easy to see that there are semantic ideas that can ground a notion of normativity. And in order to see them, we have to look at it at his materialism. And if we do that, we have to start from his revolt against idealism. This, of course, is the German ideology. A revolt that implies, among other things, also the idea that the essence of man is not to be subject to the force of reasons in the abstract. In the German ideology, Marx writes that men distinguish themselves from the animals primarily not in terms of the reasons they have, but in terms of their material lives, the material lives they have. As individuals express their life, so they are. What they are, therefore, coincides with their production, both with what they produce and with how they produce. So, in this sense, the game of giving and asking for reasons does not stand by itself. It's grounded on labor. So here is a semantic idea. Setting out from real active men and on the basis of their real life process, demonstrating the development of the ideological reflexes and echoes of this life process. Reasons themselves must be subjected to criticism to reveal their material foundation. And this is of course, why Brandom classified Marx together with Freud and Nietzsche among the great unmaskers of the 19th century. But I think there is something more about it. Marx's point is not that man is irrational or is not subject to the force of reasons. The point is about the foundation of the force of reason. That is, the relation of being a reason for something by itself makes explicit properties of a mode of production, a mode of life, where of course a mode of production and a mode of life involves not only the interaction of the individuals with nature, that they have with nature to satisfy their purposes, but also the social relations that they enter into for that purpose. And so we can say that the materialist turn that Marx gave to Hegelian dialectics suggests that contents should be understood not in terms of representation or discursiveness, but primarily in terms of labor. Notice that if we do so, we do not change really the basic semantic idea of normative inferentialism. That remains the same. To have a content is to play a role in the game of giving and asking for reasons. What we are doing is we are giving a materialist interpretation of reasons. And that's why the title, The Game of Giving and Asking for Reasons, transposes into a game of giving and asking for labor. That's the point. Now, suppose we have this notion of material content. Suppose we have found a way to project a theory of material content. Can we do semantics with it? Can we do semantic analysis? Can we define the material content of the moves in a language game? Well, it depends on the language game, of course. Usually as philosophers, we are interested mainly in the game of describing the world. But in our case, the paradigmatic game is something different, something more along the lines of the builder's practice in Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations, the second section. A is building with building stones. There are blocks, pillars, slabs, and beams. B has to pass him the stones, and to do so in the order in which A needs them. For this purpose, they make the use of a language consisting of the word block, pillar, slab, and beam. A calls them out, B brings the stone which he has learned to bring at such and such a call. So the builder asks for labor, block. The assistant complies, let's say, by shaping a boulder into a block and passing it. The assistant couldn't have complied by passing a slab, for instance, because producing a slab is incompatible with producing a block. Had the builder asked for a generic building stone, the assistant could have complied by passing a block or a pillar or a slab or a beam. Because either producing either of them implies producing a building stone, a generic building stone. So you see here as well we have relations of implication and incompatibility. And if we have those, again, we can define inferential roles, and on top of that, well, we are in business with normative inferentialism. But what about our preferred game of describing the world? Is there any chance that we can apply this idea to observational reports, for instance? A cherry tree. Is labor involved in that? Well, again, if we adopt the materialist approach, we have to start from the real man, the active man, life processes. And if we do that, we see that it's easy to understand observational reports as labor-laden, so to speak. At least labor is involved in observational reports in at least two senses. In the first sense, it's because what is reported often is itself the product of human activity. This is something that Marx notices polemically against Feuerbach. No? The cherry tree, like almost all fruit trees, was, as is well known, only a few centuries ago transplanted by commerce into our zone, and therefore only by this action of a definite society in a definite age has it become sensuous certainty for Feuerbach. But there is also another sense, maybe deeper, maybe at least more interesting for our purposes, and it's the fact that observation itself is an activity, is an interaction with nature. It's something that we do. So I claim, a cherry tree. There's a cherry tree in front of me. How am I entitled to this claim? Because I've seen it, because I've done something. I had an interaction with nature. You can be entitled too by relying on my interaction. So there is a sense in which even observational reports are involve labor, labor in the sense of an interaction with nature. But then let's suppose that this could foreshadow a semantic theory grounded on labor. Of course, there are a lot of problems, but let me focus on objectivity, since that is where we started. There's a problem that may arise at this point. One might suppose that the materialist approach by itself guarantees that contents are objective. One might think that, after all, material content is directly determined in terms of an interaction with nature. And so one might suppose that material contents are essentially objective because they are essentially independent from attitudes. But there's a risk in this idea. There's a risk that resembles closely the mythology of the given. That is the idea that the labor that corresponds to a certain interaction is a matter of fact, rather than the result of a negotiation in a social historical context. And that it is a myth, it's easy to see, not only because the nature of an interaction varies even within the same mode of production, but also because characterizing or qualifying, categorizing an interaction as an interaction of a certain sort is only possible within a network of relations of offering and demands of labor. Marx struggles with this very same problem in an analogous context. Of course, the context of his theory of value. If we follow classical economics, then we define value in terms of labor. No? But then we seem to face a dilemma. On the one hand, the idea that the labor involved in the production of a commodity is objective. It can also quantified in an objective way. It's the hours required to produce the commodity. Well, of course, it's socially necessary hours, and that might vary according to various factors, productivity of labor, the intensity of labor, and so on and so forth. But still, so value might vary, but it's still objective. It corresponds to that production. On the other hand, instead, there's the idea that value is determined by market equilibria. Basically, let's say, laws of demand and supply. In this sense, labor, and so value, depends on the preferences of the market actors. So it depends on their attitudes, and so it's not objective at all. Now, those who are familiar with the debate on the myth of the given will recognize here a familiar pattern. A dilemma between, on the one horn, the myth of a natural, objective foundation. On the other hand, a groundless system of relations that spins in the void, with no friction with reality. Now, is Marx committed to the first horn of this dilemma? I don't think so. I don't think that the point, for instance, of the chapter of on commodities is to say that the value can be determined independently of the relations among commodities. Analogously, from a semantic point of view, I don't think that Marx is committed to the myth of the given in this sense. I think that this notion of material content implies a different approach to naturalism in general. An approach in which, let's say, we can account for how our contents are about things in the world without presupposing a universal reason that is hard to introduce if it's not already there in the picture. But as you see now, I am mostly speculating. So I mean, the purpose of my talk was much more modest, and I will be happy if I conveyed you the idea of material content. Of course, there is a lot of work to be done to characterize this idea, to explore the extent in which it can be applied in semantics. For me, the most fascinating part of it has to do with analyzing the way in which certain vocabularies of certain practices can be understood as making explicit properties of material content. And that would be, again, has been mentioned a lot of times, an expressivist reading of ideology, an expressivist reading of the relation between base and superstructure. But that is not something that I've thought through enough, so thank you for now.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really love that. I just wanted to ask about the suggestion you made that if we take this route, we might end up with sort of leaving the inferentialism intact. And I wondered if that's right. So I had in mind the language game with the builders as well, and I wondered if there's a risk of sort of imposing too much of our much more sophisticated language game on that. So, for instance, as I remember it, they don't have the concept of stone. They just have these particular.
Yeah,
I'm thinking when Wittgenstein says, "Well, we might translate what he's saying as bring me that slab," but we shouldn't over-interpret what's going on. So I just wonder if there's will we end up with just a kind of a picture where we have a material basis for the game of giving or asking for reasons, or that language game, as it's circumscribed very tightly by Wittgenstein, doesn't look like a game of giving and asking for reasons. It looks like a use of a very limited language to engage with the world, but that doesn't quite meet the bar of that. So
I think so. Well, I think there are several problems with this. So thank you for your question. In a sense, what I was saying is that it's just that you have to keep the basic idea of the notion of content. So inferentialism in that broad Sellarsian sense. Then, once you have that, to what kind of games can you apply that? I had a point in the other slide that I didn't show you because it was already too late. And one major problem is exactly that. I mean, how can we generalize this approach to the whole of language games that we have? And of course, I mean, I don't have shoulders wide enough to support that claim as Brandom did. I mean, even if for the inferentialist Brandomian approach, it's not easy to generalize it beyond a certain extent. I mean, I can see how color game works. But then, what is the inferential content of a quantifier, for instance? We never get. We've never got that from Brandom. So that is a general problem with the inferentialist approach. How much can be generalized? Of this approach, I value especially the possibility, the expressivist possibility, to show how some properties of language games can be made explicit, to use Brandom's terminology, and or maybe conversely taken back to properties of practices. That would be already an interesting point. But about the generalization, I'm optimistic, but at the same time skeptical.
Thank you for that. That was really interesting. I had a question about the specificity of labor in the way that you were describing this. So on the one hand, you have this diagram here in which the kind of frictionless spinning side of things includes payment for the production of commodities and so on. But then when you were talking about your observation of the cherry tree, it's much more just doing something. And I was wondering if you'd thought about how specific you would want labor to be in this kind of mapping of the concepts onto each other, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. I thought about it a bit. It's a mess. What I thought for now is that, and that's why I called it an analogy. It's not the same. It's not the same. We had a talk before about the relations between concepts and money, for instance. I think there's an analogy there, but it's not the same thing. For instance, it cannot be abstract labor. You want specific content, so you cannot abstract. The content of producing a stone must be different from the content of producing a slab. Otherwise, you cannot have content. So there already you cannot have exchange value in the form of exchange value. I think that the most promising way to address this point is to say that both contents and values, and so labor, are species of a same general, more general genus, which is a specific kind of social object. But that would be my strategy. I don't have it already done. Yeah.
I was just wondering how important you think how the animal aspect of our being leaps into this for you, because I think the thing that I always find quite problematic about, say, a Brandom type account is, you could have these machines just giving and asking, like exchanging language with each other. And I think to me what labour brings out is, in its material aspect, the fact that we have these bodies and we have these needs, and that interacts with the labour that we demand from each other. Is that something that you think, I suppose, is that also important to you in the concept of labour? The fact that we're not merely machines exchange, like, can machines give and ask for labour, I suppose, is the question.
Yeah. Well, yes. I confess this. One of the things that I in my humble opinion, is more problematic of Brandom's approach is this use of the space of reasons as a tool to demarcate the domain of animals and the domain of humans, sentience from sapience. Doesn't sound plausible in that sense. That's why I was hinting at a new approach, a different approach to naturalism. Because once you have these abilities to interact with nature, of course the continuity is much more plausible. The problem, on the other hand, with this idea is that you cannot make labor just a label for whatever interaction with nature can happen to be. You have to specify it a little bit. So of course, in Marx's approach, the point of labor is to produce commodities, let's say. And there you have at least a context in which to apply and to think about differences between different forms of life. Here we must be much more careful, because on the one hand, you want to consider also the interactions that animals have, and so possibly to define contents for the animal mind. On the other hand, you must specify what differences are there in this notion. So you have a continuity, but you cannot reject the market, at least I think. You cannot reject completely the problem of distinguishing the kinds of labor that are involved in the practice. So you can have games of giving and asking for labor for animals, but you have to explain why those are different from those of man. Maybe because they involve meta-representation, but meta-representation is dead. That's good news, as I said.